Okay, so you had happening what I refer to as the quote politics of incarceration, which basically is the dilemma faced by the United States, especially the government, of course, where there was this felt need to incarcerate Japanese on the West Coast, the entire ethnic population. But that's a clear violation of constitutional rights. How is this going to be overcome, this dilemma? Well, I just referred to the fact that you see politicians, media, national leaders all clamoring for this. And, even our most prominent politicians were, sending messages to the government that this should be done. I have a few quotes here from John Dingell. One congressman said, quote, the U.S. should cause the forceful imprisonment in a concentration camp of alien Japanese, unquote. Congressman John Rankling and Leland Ford urged the president to, quote, quit coddling the Japanese, and that, quote, citizen or not, should be placed in a concentration camps far away from the inland areas, unquote. So you have, again, government officials and the military officials. By late December 1941, you see them convening, that's to say, the Justice Department and the War Department. They're convening to discuss the constitutionality of the evacuation. Of course, there's no way to get around it as being a clear violation of constitutional rights. So, in this regard, the Justice Department, which is a civilian department, was understandably cautious since it was a clear violation of the legal rights of citizens. Uh, so, what happened is it got uh, transferred over to the War Department. Okay, and with the War Department, you could find justification for the abridgment or taking away of constitutional rights, suspending them as long as it deals with military necessity. The phrase we use today is national security. Okay, but it's important to say not all officials were anxious to imprison the Japanese. Okay, there's some people in the Justice Department that said, "Hey, we can't do this." Some officials, I don't want to paint this picture as just a complete and total assault on Japanese rights. Okay, so but nonetheless, the decision shifted from the shoulders of the Justice Department to the War Department, and it was determined that if it could be justified due to military necessity, then it was going to happen. Okay, so what happened next was by February 19th, 1942, you have this up here, the Executive Order 9066, where FDR, President Roosevelt, signed this order which mandated the evacuation of all persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast towards relocation centers found more inland, away from the coast. And of course, the result of this order would be something I stated earlier, that is, the imprisonment of 120,000 people, and roughly two-thirds of them being U.S. citizens, the Nisei. Um, and some of them would be incarcerated for up to 4 years. Okay. Now, before we get into life behind barbed wires, that is to say, the concentration camps, it's important to note something that General DeWitt stated here in his official pronouncement as to why the Japanese should be interned. Now, General DeWitt, again, is the general in charge with the relocation of Japanese Americans. And of course, he has to put forth his official declaration here as to why it's justified. And we'll look at this right now. So, this is the official statement made by General DeWitt regarding Japanese internment and its justification. As it states here, President Roosevelt relied heavily upon the recommendation of Stimson, Secretary of War, when he implemented Executive Order 9066. Henry L. Stimson relied upon Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, Commanding General of the Western Defense Command, with responsibility for West Coast security. So again, this is his justification, his rationale for exclusion and internment. This is it. In the war, in which we are now engaged, racial affinities are not severed by migration. Okay, now affinities means connection. So what he's saying with this statement here is that we are at war with Japan, and he says here, they're the enemy race, which of course is true, and that's not controversial. But he makes this statement here that regarding the Japanese race, even if they're in America and they've been Americanized, quote, racial affinities are not severed by migration. What does that mean? Racial connections are not severed by migration. It means that no matter what, regardless of acculturation and assimilation, regardless if they're second or maybe even third generation, he says that they will always be, racially speaking, Japanese, regardless of migration. Okay, and he says here, while many second and third generation Japanese born on U.S. soil, possessed of U.S. citizenship, have become, quote, Americanized, the racial strains are undiluted. And again, this basically connects to what he said earlier. The racial strains are undiluted. So that means basically that it doesn't matter if they're second or third generation even. It doesn't matter if they're Americanized or acculturated or assimilated. The fact remains, according to DeWitt, that they will always be Japanese. They will always be, Oriental, and therefore, they're not truly American. And then he used a bit of faulty logic here. To conclude otherwise is to expect that children born of white parents on Japanese soil sever all racial affinity and become loyal Japanese subjects, ready to fight and, if necessary, to die for Japan in a war against the nation of their parents. So he can't even conceive of that possibility with that sentence and that argument he's saying. What if it's the opposite that was true, right? No matter what, you can't see Western persons or American person for that matter, fighting for Japan, right? It's inconceivable, he's saying. So what is he doing here? He's saying that no matter what, they're not American, basically. Okay, they're Japanese. And if you pressed him further as to why he felt this way and therefore justifying internment because they can't be loyal, simply because they're, quote, Japanese, right? They're not Japanese Americans. They're not, let alone Americans, they're Japanese. If you pressed him further, you could probably uncover this ideology of Orientalism again, right? Orientalism, as you know, presupposes the fact that those in the Oriental world cannot become Occidental. They can't be Westernized, no matter what. And this is the background assumption of DeWitt. I hope that's readily apparent to students. He cannot conceive of Japanese becoming Americanized, even if they may appear to be so, right, in their speech, in their culture, and what have you. Okay, so again, because of Orientalism, because he believes that no matter what, the racial strains are undiluted, this is justifying exclusion and therefore internment. If they can't be Americanized, that means they're Japanese. And of course, the Japanese are an enemy race. So therefore, we have enemies upon American soil and they should be interned. Okay, so again, this is his rationale. And now, even though he's not stating it, we know as students of Asian American history that he's making all these connections with the assumption, the presupposition in the ideology of Orientalism and the fact that Orientals cannot become Occidental. So, with the signing of 1966, the executive order, General DeWitt proceeded to initiate the logistics involved in mass evacuation and, things like a curfew for all enemy aliens, quote unquote, or, quote, persons of Japanese ancestry was set. They could only travel to work. They couldn't venture within a 5-mile radius of their place of residence. And then by the end of March, you start seeing evacuation underway. what's happening during this time. For example, you see the bank accounts and liquid assets basically frozen. So a lot of the Japanese Americans had to go to their bank and withdraw their cash if they were lucky to do so. Otherwise, they would lose it. In terms of personal belongings and property, they were only allowed to bring what they could carry in one piece of luggage. So that's their clothing, maybe some toiletries, beddings, everything else they lost. Um, Pets, household goods, and vehicles. Okay, if you owned an automobile, well, if you were unable to sell it within a week or two, you lost it. Not to mention houses and places of businesses. You see Japanese Americans who are actually involved in places of business, let's say in LA, having to sell their property at these outrageously low prices. Same with the homes. Okay, if you didn't do that, you lost your home. So all of this is basically, it's not confiscated, of course, but it had to be sold at bargain prices. Now, what happens here is first, they had to build the internment camps. So, what the logistics behind this did is form what's called assembly centers, okay, where they're going to meet first. They report to assembly centers and wait there for, weeks or if not months, okay, more likely months, okay. Okay, they stay there, and many of these places are on fairgrounds, on racetracks. A well-known assembly center was in Santa Anita Racetrack, the Santa Anita Racetrack in Los Angeles. Okay, so if you were from San Diego or LA, you had to report to the Santa Anita Racetrack. And they're forced to live there in horse stalls. Okay, and many complained about the smell of the horses, and it was really dirty, and unsanitary, uncomfortable. And then after a while, the administration in charge, by the way, I should mention this, now, with military necessity established by the Department of War, again, the responsibility of relocation shifted to another civilian agency that was formed, and that's called the War Relocation Authority. And it was headed by the brother of General Eisenhower. His name was Milton Eisenhower. Okay, but the War Relocation Authority was responsible for transferring the detainees from these assembly centers to the actual, quote, relocation centers. That was the euphemism for internment. Okay, the camps. By the way, this brings up the question: is, quote, concentration camp an accurate term? Well, as I just quoted a previous senator before Executive 9066, he used the term concentration camp. FDR, the president, openly used the term. The military, on the other hand, and the WRA, the War Relocation Authority, preferred to use the term, quote, relocation center. All right. Now, this brings up the question: why didn't the Japanese resist? Why didn't they protest in mass, right? Why this open cooperation with barely any resistance? I should mention also that before internment was underway, you had meetings of, Japanese organizations discussing how to deal with this, right? What are they going to do? Are they going to oppose it? Well, the general consensus was this, despite some people saying, hey, no matter what, I'm not going to report to the concentration camps, right? But the general consensus was this, that the Japanese should obey Executive Order 96. So this brings up a question. It's a clear violation of their constitutional rights. And therefore, you would think that, as blatant as it is, that, they should protest. But they knew the consequences, the Japanese. Should they protest, let's say march in the streets and even, riot in the streets? They know the consequences of that in terms of the image it would project to the American public. It would portray them and depict them as being disobedient, right? Not following the law, and therefore being, you know, disloyal citizens, right? And therefore it would reinforce that image, the stigma of them being not loyal to the United States because they're disobeying laws. Okay, so they knew the dilemma there, and therefore they decided that the best thing to do would be not to protest and just to basically cooperate, and just follow instructions, right? So they all met in the camps and in the assembly center, excuse me, and they got sent to the camps. And here we see a story not of resistance again, but of survival. They're placed in these camps. They're surrounded by armed guards. They're surrounded by barbed wire. You see floodlights, the big floodlights all around. And this reminds us that, you know what? It is a concentration camp. Okay, now it would be, of course, very wrong to compare them to the Nazi concentration camps in, say, Auschwitz, right, or Treblinka. No, it's definitely not that. They're not factories of death, so to speak. But they are forcing people here behind barbed wire, excuse me, and they are imprisoned. Okay, so in that sense, it's a concentration camp. And, it's barely suitable for human habitation, as many of them complained. They were assigned in these barrack halls, much like one you would see in a military base. But let's remember that they were put up hastily, right, as depicted in this slide here. Barely suitable for habitation. And I should also mention, since they're away from inland, they're in places that are already very desolate. All the 10 concentration camps that were set up, okay, places away from settlement. Okay, so that was the strategy here, to keep them away from the population. Inland, places like Utah and South Dakota, and as far south actually as Arkansas, and of course California. Now in the camp again, it's very uncomfortable, to put it mildly. They slept on army cots, no beds. They're assigned places in the halls, the barrack halls, often too small for families with children. Sometimes children were separated from their parents. Okay, that didn't happen a lot, but it was determined that a certain person was not as loyal when they conducted uh, you know, um, loyalty investigations. Well, they would separate some of the parents. There's no individual kitchens. Everyone ate at a dining hall. Almost everyone complained about the food as being horrible. Of course, the toilet and bathing facilities were minimal. Many of them were not private enough. Now, there were some supply stores in the camps, but let's remember that people's assets were frozen for many of them. So those without the foresight to bring cash money had no means to improve their lives. But I should say also that it's an attempt to form community in there, regardless of the situation. You see Japanese, well, for one thing, there were jobs available for some of the residents in the camp, so at least they could make a little bit of money. Jobs like teachers, janitors, doctors, but for the most part, they're very underpaid as opposed to civic society. You had schools set up, of course, libraries, hospitals, churches. And then the attempt to form community was not only through the jobs, but through, um, the assignment of leaders, or even voting taking place of who should be the leaders. You see a community government form, a semblance of government inside. But despite the semblance of community, for the most part, it's a life of incarceration. Again, you have armed guards pointing the guns at you. And I'm saying pointing the guns at you because some people rationalize Japanese internment as we are protecting the Japanese from American citizens who are hostile towards them, right? That was some of the government rhetoric. But then the Japanese thought about this. They said, then why are they pointing the guns inward towards us and not outward, right? By the way, there were a few incidents of people who decided to walk out of the camp. Perhaps they had enough. Perhaps they were psychologically unsettled. And for doing that, they were shot and killed. It didn't happen a lot again, but some few incidents. Not to mention, it's just a life of tedious boredom, of psychological depression, dislocation, even family dislocation. Um, if anything positive that can be derived from it, it was a time when Japanese Americans could at least assume some roles in the community, right? In their own community that may have been denied to them in dominant society, like community leaders, teachers. In the high school there, they had captains of athletic teams, yearbook editors who were Japanese, of course, right? Because they're all Japanese, but they wouldn't be able to do that in, again, civic society at that time. Okay, so that's life behind barbed wire, and as I described, it's certainly not an agreeable or comfortable life that they are experiencing.